If you think about the materials, they're like the building blocks of those like virtual pixels. To have them, the elements and the ingredients like ready to go is incredibly important.
Welcome back to the Most Modern podcast. At Under Armour, she built the company's first virtual material library. A material bank, she's shaping how the architecture and design world sources and experiences materials digitally. Manwen Li's impressive career sits at the intersection of design, science, and strategy. In today's episode, she walks us through the intricacies of making the physical digital. Let's get into it.
모스트 보던 팟캐스트.
Why do we need accurate digital representations of physical materials?
Well, I think like we're talking today as all like design professionals, right? You guys build things. I built physical product in the past. Is this like constant iteration visually, like with yourself, it's very important as creators. So in our creation process, it's like, even if you're drawing something or in the modern times, just like most people, like we build 3D representation of a mug or a pair of shoes or a building in this case, before we turn them into actual like a physical product, physical building. So it's really important. If you think about the materials, they're like the building blocks of those like virtual pixels. To have them, the elements and the ingredients like ready to go is incredibly important. The closer you are to reality, the more like visual feedback you have as a creator in your like creative process. So I think it's just incredibly important for for the sake of efficiency and for the sake of creativity in general.
So besides architectural renderings, what other uses for digital materials are there right now?
Well, I came from like the fashion industry. So in my past life, I worked for Under Armour and one of the largest like sourcing company called like they changed names so many times, but it was Global Brands Group back then, part of the Fun Group. So we advocate for years of using this like accurate 3D creation pipeline to build apparel, footwear, accessories before it goes into production. So that's a common practice. I think industrial design, same thing. You model a chair before you build a chair. Same thing with a lot of other like furniture. I mean, you guys may consider that's like part of the architecture industry, but I see it as consumer goods and like home furnishing industry. So yeah, I think it's a common practice. You want to like model or mock up something virtually before you want to like use physical materials to actually
absolutely
prototype them. So
But what happens if we don't have accurate materials? I think I had a brief career in architecture, but materials kind of come in late into the process. Usually in the beginning, you're just looking at shapes, looking at forms. So why is it important to connect these realistic assets to the AEC design process?
Well, kind of like a long story. So I think we should start by talking about like the role of material bank in the industry. So material bank started in 2018 as this centralized platform to connect A&D professionals with manufacturers. So we started in like the sampling business. Our founder kind of had this like genius idea. It's like everyone is requesting samples from their reps. How about we just like aggregate all of them and we ship everything overnight? So I think Libo's question is like, what happens if we don't have this like digital material? So what we saw is, first we revolutionized the sampling process. So that's like, okay, great, you got a box, amazing. It's on your desk. You're gonna put together a mood board. We also realized a lot of our members do have this like very high desire of like accurate representation digitally. So they started by asking, hey, can I have like a very high resolution image of this materials? What happened is, when they don't have it, one of the two things happens. One is they will just use something very generic. They will download from Google and like, tile the whole thing, process it themselves, or they will get it from the manufacturers and post-process the entire materials by themselves. So in this whole process, a lot of inefficiencies are happening. Like if the four of us here gonna each reach out to one manufacturers, get this materials, tile them, which probably costs you like 30 minutes to an hour. We're talking about 4 hours, like totality of our time. That's very wasteful, and if you think about it economically. It's the same thing in the fashion industry. There's like a a company called Swatchbook. It's kind of the 3D asset, material asset platform for everybody in the fashion industry. All the suppliers who supply materials to those brands, they have to digitize the materials many times. Like, so they just aggregate everybody and to put it in one platform. So the professionals can just like download and use in their own creation pipeline instead of creating them all themselves. We were kind of doing it. I mean, my team was kind of doing it at Under Armour, like on the individual effort as well. But from the aggregation perspective, it's like if everyone is doing it, there's always a benefit of just reuse the asset.
When you talk about digital materials, what type of information or data points are you talking about? How many of them is included? Let's say, for example, if I want a carpet, how many data points are we talking about here?
That's a loaded question. So when we capture anything visual, right, it's kind of complicated because it's not a linear process. We don't say, hey, there's like 10 data points and we just like put them in a spreadsheet and upload them. So what actually is going to happen is we treat everything as a surface. There's this whole like philosophical method called like physics-based rendering. But what really is happening is in the rendering process, the model, like the interpreter, the translator of the data is treating everything they get from the data purely like strictly focus a physics-based model, which means they don't interpret things, they don't add things just to make it look prettier or shinier. So one of the best kind of like industry practice in gaming or in visualization in different industries, like we try to follow this like physics-based rendering, which we call PBR process. So collecting those data is a process. Basically, you scan this material many, many times from different angle, and you start to collect, okay, this looks, like this from this angle, this looks like that. And you kind of like aggregate everything into like a data package. So this package basically tell the machine, say, this is the surface, this is the color, this is how high and low those surfaces are, give them a map. So think about those like, mountains and swamps in like on Google Maps. So those maps are basically the Google map for those render engine to say, hey, render this material this way. This is more texturized, that this is much, much more flat and reflective. So it's really like, long story short, is a lot of data points, but they are being recorded in a form of a map.
So my understanding is with any sort of digital visualization, you're basically applying digital values to what's essentially a file, but trying to replicate how that material would interact with light and physics in the real world. So there's a glossiness setting, there's a translucency, a transparency setting. And how much of your work goes into getting a high fidelity sort of correlation between what's real and what's digital?
I would say like the whole reason why people try to follow like the PBR process is try to be as realistic as possible. There's always like things will get lost in translation between like how much you can actually capture to how much you can actually render it out in the virtual environment and how much the final artist will like add their own like retouching to make it like a little better. So I would say like in my effort with both with Under Armour and with Material Bank, we try to be as objective as possible, which is actually really, really hard to do. Like, it's like, think about weather. I think this may be a better, a good metaphor to use. Think about weather. We kind of like have to come up with a numerical system to communicate weather. And when I say, hey, it's like 68 today, like I may feel cold and you may feel like perfectly pleasant. So in this process, it's kind of like also, but the key is have a standard, right? In a parallel world, like 68 may be like 100, but the key is to have a standard. So we set up a standard, we follow the standard, we try not to add intervention in the process. So at the end of the day, we capture as much as possible, but there's always things much, much more complicated. Real world is amazing, fascinating, and beautiful in their own way. When things are super, let's take, my favorite example is those like tile with glaze on top. Like it's almost impossible to capture them because the machine will never know, hey, like how the light is actually, pass through the tile, go through the glaze, and how thick is the glaze. Those are the things the machine would never know. So we would always like add a layer of interpretation from like our like angle. Like we try to automate as much
So
as
the process
possible.
that you guys made, is this a standardized process that everyone who's capturing things in the real world, I know video game, they capture a lot of real world assets, or did you have to develop something in-house specifically for building materials?
I'll break your question into three things. So in the gaming world, it's all back to purpose, right? In gaming or video game or virtual effect, that industry, they want things to look nice. So yes, they do capture a lot of things, but also when we think about the cost of acquisition in the video or in the filming industry or virtual production industry, they can tolerate much higher cost per acquisition because to make one film, it's like the total, I guess the total revenue is like large enough they can afford to like, I know one of my friend who's like actually in the industry, like they will sometimes like spend a whole day just to capture this like little piece of swatch to make sure their like character have this like high fidelity, like I don't know, like a sweater on them. And when I heard about it, kind of in past life, I was digitizing materials for a t-shirt, right? A t-shirt like the Under Armour. We sell it for like $30, $50. And the t-shirt itself is, the material itself have like a relatively like low physical value. So we're like, okay, this is how much we're gonna do. It's like buying cars. You can buy a 20,000 car. You can buy a $200,000 car. You can buy a $2 million car. So we chose to be in this like cost-effective mode in like a large scale production level of digitization. While the gaming industry is two extremes. Either they want amazing fidelity like crazy, or they're just like, I don't care, I'm just going to generate something. You can actually generate those things with AI today and just use it in the game because you want speed and you want things to be actually really, really, really fast.
When you guys developed the system, like what were those
Mm-hmm.
priorities, right? You have
Yeah.
different motivations than the video game industry, like you have said. So what is that motivation for you guys, and how do you tailor the standard towards that?
Well, the goal, I mean, I've digitized the material for different industries. The goal is always to serve the creator. So first and foremost is to remain objectivity and authenticity of the materials. So, I mean, past life, I talked to a lot of suppliers. They really care about like every single fiber and yarn of their materials. And when you pass on to designers, like you may never notice that difference, but it's incredibly important for them. And so that's like the number one priority. The second one is it has to be efficient enough. We used to digitize like thousands of materials at like in the fashion industry every season. So we can't really like zoom in onto like the microscope level. So that's also like one of the priorities. Like it has to be standard, it has to be consistent, have relatively high quality and remain like super objective and very like authentic to the original material. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing is we are using those assets to inform and infer something physical. So this kind of like difference from the video game industry is fundamental to like all of us who touch physical material.
Before we move on, I want to clarify
Mm-hmm.
something that you're talking about,
Yeah.
Manwen, which is the wide applicability of digital materials. And I
Mm-hmm.
imagine that your career has also followed a trajectory that probably closely aligns with the amount of rendering and digital visualization we're seeing in the real world right now. Like I was watching television yesterday and I saw a car ad and it literally said at the bottom, this is a digital representation. So I'm
Yeah.
curious if you can tell us, besides architectural renderings that you might see in a magazine or besides clips that you might see in a Pixar movie, what other forms of digital application are we using? Sorry, let me rephrase that. What other ways are digital materials being applied to things that we encounter in everyday life that we probably don't recognize?
When we started this conversation, we talked about industries, right? I forgot the automobile industry. They're one of the early starters in like visualization, just because there's a lot of passion there. It's high cost to build a car, and if you never saw a car designer in your life, they are like incredibly proud of their. I mean, same as you guys, but They're so proud of their work. They're so obsessed with their work. And there are numerous amount of investment going into digitizing the paint of the car in terms of to be truly reflective, to be true, like the I guess the color fidelity is like so important for them. So definitely automobile industry, like a lot of car configurator, when you go to a showroom, right? When you select the configurator, sometimes you can do the drive in like a VR headset. This is kind of relatively standard for a lot of like higher end car business, obviously. And I think a lot of people start to do this like before you buy your home. There's a lot of like standard service to have. You can walk through the entire house on a headset and just to like you can see your kitchen before you even buy it. You buy a pre-construction house. So those are like purely rendering, right? Because you don't have the house yet. Like someone's trying to build it for you. Someone's trying to give you this is how it's going to look like. Or do you want to change anything? Fashion, like ads. I think H&M recently announced they're going to use AI model. Like they didn't, so everyone's like start to ask like, is the shirt going to be real? But a lot of like, you'll be surprised, actually a lot of advertising, like the content in advertising is already fully like visualized. In 2020, I think this is super interesting. And we presented in one of the conferences a case study from Under Armour. We couldn't get any samples in time for photo shoot. So we end up just digitizing the entire line, and we put a lot of like 3D model on the website directly, just because like, you know, the entire time we need logistics, we need to arrange the final production samples to the photo studio. Like that couldn't happen in time because of the supply chain disruption. So there were a lot of like 3D model just being sold on the website. Like people actually don't notice that often. If like, you'll be surprised.
I think if we actually squinted our eyes and looked at all the visuals we see every day and tried to discern if it was real or fake, I think we would be surprised with how much digital visualization we're seeing just in advertising, in media.
100%. And in most of the visual virtual production world, right, all the background, like no matter if it's like a street in San Francisco, a lot of them for cost purposes or maybe for ease, just general for like logistic purposes, it's already fully virtualized. So you see like actors walking in front of LED just to do the whole shooting. It's very, very like common.
Yeah, the volume that they made for The Mandalorian, which is just a bunch of screens that project a horizon and a territory. It's pretty impressive, actually.
Yeah. Is it because doing things in real life got so much more expensive? That's why businesses are using more and more and leaning towards digital, creating a digital environment? Or is it creating a digital environment is way more cheaper so that they can save a lot by doing it? Is that the reason why they're going more to digital?
To answer your question backwards, first, yes, creating things digitally is much more, like it's much cheaper these days. You can today go to ChatGPT, say, hey, give me a, like green dress, and then he will just produce something for you. You may not like it, but it's very cheap, like in that sense. Doing things incredibly well, like to create a fully accurate digital twin of anything, it's still expensive because of everything we just talked about. Things has to be incredibly authentic, have to replicate things is actually much more expensive than just like create something from scratch. That does not need to match something physical. But I think for you guys are actually creating buildings and creating space, there's always this like early stage. It really depends on like which stage are we talking about. In early stage, you cannot actually create a building without having the visuals, without having all the drawings, without all the engineering pieces plotted out. So it's kind of like a necessity.
I have a potentially rabbit hole question, and you guys tell me if this is too weird. But on the topic of representing reality digitally, when you were describing your process earlier, it sounded like you guys are doing photogrammetry, right? A lot of photographic captures, and then you stitch them together into a texture and bake that into a material. Is that fair?
It's not fair, but do you want me to go to that rabbit hole?
Well, so I was going to say there's the other way, right? Where you build procedural materials from the ground up.
Yes.
where you like tile, you do the generating the wood grain and everything from a procedural level. And when you're talking about like capturing the way that the tile has a certain diffusion at the surface, it seems like that's something that might be much better represented through a procedural material rather than kind of something that's photogrammetry captured. So do you do both? Like, how do you weigh the decision between the two?
Sorry, Lee, but why is that? I have no idea what the technology means. So can you explain what the dichotomy might signify?
So a rock, right? You go out into the woods and you're like, I really like how that rock looks. So what you can do is you could take a bunch of pictures of that rock and use a technique called photogrammetry where it finds matching points on all those photographs to reassemble a 3D model. And it produces really realistic looking things. Like if you go online, what's it called? TurboSquid has a bunch of these like photogrammetry models, and they're like real objects that you can drop into your video game, your rendering, things like that. The other way is you kind of like use Grasshopper. You start from maybe a point, maybe a surface, and you generate the material procedurally. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. I think most recently with Blender geometry nodes, you can kind of generate both the geometry and then the texture above it so that everything comes from a program. Like nothing is extracted directly from nature. So in the example, I think of a glass tile, like that's kind of really interesting because one of the things you learn when you do photogrammetry or 3D scanning is that reflective and translucent materials are really hard to capture. But we already have a way of describing those kind of materials in rendering engines. So I guess part of the question is it something where when you have materials like that, you then make that choice of like, hey, maybe I just fabricate this completely from the ground up to look like reality rather than take reality and capture it digitally?
That's a really good question. So there's a lot of technicality behind it, but I would just may use ChatGPT as an example just because, we're all spending half of our life in ChatGPT these days. When you ask ChatGPT to generate 4 people sitting together doing a podcast, it's not going to be 4 of us exactly. And it's even if, let's just say we put everyone's headshot there, like there's always like things that's going to be different, right? But the creation cost is so low, you can like do that easily if you don't need it to be like accurate. But in the physical world, like I think the constant like dilemma where like we face is like we need this thing to be exactly the representation of the physical, like because we have to produce it, or maybe because the product is already produced, either if it's a piece of materials or if it's a t-shirt or if it's a mug, it's already produced. You want this representation for something else, for ads, for communication. In that case, you need it to be 100% accurate because you're selling this physical thing, not this digital thing. So if we think about this two extreme side of the things, it's actually very like philosophical. Sometimes creating the digital ones are so cheap, people start to say, hey, let's just create 100 of them and then we'll figure out how to produce them. That's a totally different like workflow or thought process. It could be incredibly harder. Like let's say incredibly more difficult. I don't think anyone perfectly like cracked the code just yet. You can kind of doing the zigzag, like keep trying to mix and match, like eventually meet in the middle. Like I created something and then I make something that's close to that. But I feel this like end-to-end journey is like not being fully fleshed out. But just to answer Libo's question earlier, yes, there are materials that are much easier to scan actually. I mean, photogrammetry is kind of it's one of the ways to recreate them. There are materials that are much easier to create from scratch. But in this creating from scratch process, you're basically like, someone has to look at this tile, say, hey, like this is my interpretation, right? You're doing all this like calculation or interpretation in your head and trying to translate them into the program language and say, hey, give me like this like 2mm thickness of glaze. And so I can recreate this like surface. That can be like more or less cost effective, depends on the materials. Like materials like really like I'm a trained like fiber science major, so like I'm really obsessed with all this like material related properties. Like they are so complicated because the real world is very, very imperfect, and so we create things and they look different in different lighting. They sometimes just look like imperfect, like the imperfection. We actually, like our eye actually feels good about this imperfection. That's why when you look at very, very perfect digital representation, sometimes you just feel it looks fake.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
It may be related to how I feel when I watch an anime that's scripted with hand, that things get more exaggerated, they're more attractive, but when things are all converted to 3D with exact numbers, then things don't really touch me as the sketch does. So maybe that's related.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like the perfect means there's no flaw. It's purely repetitive, that the pixels just keep repeating themselves. But like the real world is not like that. We're trained in real life, like we see beauty as in like, I don't know, the Grand Canyon, like you know, like people's face, like it's all like imperfect. So we do have this like actually fundamental love for imperfection. Like, yeah. Sorry, that got very
Wow.
philosophical, but
But
yeah.
how much of your work actually goes into creating that sort of material serendipity that you're talking about?
Well, my most of the time, like I spend in digitization of materials is to replicate the physical object itself. So sometimes we do get into, actually, this is a good example. Can you guys see my shirt? It's a heather shirt. And like the heather effect is you cannot find a perfect repeat on this piece of like material. So when we sometimes like scan it and recreate it, we have to like add a lot of noises. So a lot of software like it's already have this like built-in just, oh, you can just like add noise, because once you start to repeat it, no matter how big you scan it, you will eventually see the pattern to start to show up. So there's a lot of like manipulation. We just like want to make things look more realistic by making it less perfect.
Is that sort of trying to fight against uncanniness? Like we've all seen
Yeah.
renderings that feel very plastic and artificial. So you're saying that not only are there deliberate processes that you guys would put in to actually fix that, but now you're starting to code that into how you digitalize in the first place and starting to, I guess, embed that randomness into the material.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very like this whole like topic is super super vertical, right? We can like go into this rabbit hole forever, but yes, I think one of the maybe a better piece of information I can share is there's actually a lot more people trying to look into the method that can directly connect to production. So a lot of people are trying to look at like yarn, for example, textile. I'm just like very deeply familiar with textile. There are people start to look into yarn level creation of materials, so that you start with like basically the molecule level, so it can grow into something more organic instead of like, hey, let's just scan this piece of fabric and just repeat it and everything will be fine. So yeah, I mean the creation process is like you can start at any point and kind of like add or change things from there. But yeah, I mean, I would just say like when we look at a lot of renderings, like the uncanny feelings come from all over the place. Sometimes just from lighting, or you're using a very weird piece of furniture that's never exists in real life. Like your mind cannot logically say, hey, this is why I look fake, but you can see it looks fake because you're processing much more information. So people are trying in all kinds of ways, lighting, objects, texture itself, to like make things look realistic. And it's not always easy.
Okay. So it seems like a pretty common need, right? Like Alex, Minku, you both rendered before. We've all had to hand make our materials. It's happening at firms everywhere. Every firm kind of has a little folder of all these materials that people have made. Why hasn't there been someone who's just made a platform where all of these are available and serves everybody together?
That's an excellent question. First, everybody tried. There's a lot of people that out there trying. If you go to like Epic Games, Unity, TurboSquid, you mentioned TurboSquid before. There's so many like texture and objects like marketplace out there, and people can go and download. But it's more or less a creator marketplace. Like you can create something and upload there, try to sell it for like 50 cents or $1. And Minku can do it, and I can do like so. Everyone come together at different level of quality. So it started to be, is it helpful? Of course it's helpful, but when you try to create your project in the entire like virtual environment, all this different quality came in become like chore for you. You have to fix them. You have to like, make sure everything is UV mapped properly. So to start, it's like people try. There are people out there trying. It's more or less like organic creator-based marketplace. And second is there's really lack of standard. Like there's no standard for everyone. Like when you say a good digital materials or a good 3D model, like what are we talking about? What is good? What is good enough? What is excellent quality, right? We talked about this before. In the filming industry, sometimes they can spend a whole day just to create one piece of realistic texture, or they can create a mobile app, just use a color block. So the lack of quality is a human issue. Like everyone have to sit down and agree what do they think is quality, and it's incredible. It's very hard. It's like four of us agree what is a good cup of coffee. It's impossible. Like how do I even talk about it to start? And then the third one is kind of like, is it costing you a lot of time to create those textures? Yes. But is it killing you? No. Like every time you build a project, I actually just talked to a designer yesterday who worked for like a very large firm, usually like work in workplace project. She said like sometimes she will use like 20 to 50 materials in one project, and she will spend most of her days in Revit and then later like render in Inkscape. But I was like, your firm have like, 50,000 people. Like, is there no texture library for this? She was like literally sitting there thinking. I was like, do we have it? Do we have it? Oh no, we don't have it. I was like, but why? You're doing this over and over and over again. I think to make something and some of you guys went to MIT, right? There's a very famous class in MIT is two very famous class. One is how to make things or how to make anything. I can't remember the actual name. The other one is how to make tools to make anything. So I think It's two very different mindset.
I haven't heard of them, but it sounds like MIT. It means Emmaus.
Yeah, like if you get you're in Boston and you also teach at MIT, like you may want to take the class. It's like, I think it's two very different mindset to build a room and to figure out how to build all the toolkits to build those virtual environment more productive, like on a daily basis, is two very different mindset. So I came from a design background. For me to make a suit or to make a piece of product is very different than building an assembly line to make this all day long. Right. So I think most of the firm, right, you guys focus on design, focus on the creation process. It's not those creators' job to actually build a library. It takes someone who have the perspective of creating those at scale, considering all the use cases from all the different phases in the projects, and to find a way to understand all the technicality, like on the surface level enough to like connect all the dots is very challenging. So I think I thought about this a lot because I'm in this like position of we like as Material Bank, we serve all the A&D community. We see all the firms like doing different things. We see their needs and we know could be a gap to be closed. So maybe we're in this perfect viewpoint to see all these things and like actually make a difference. So yeah, that's why
There's also a generational divide here because most firms have some sort of physical material library. So I think that maybe that eventually down the road that will become more standardized to have a clear digital library. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that I'm keep on thinking about is your connection to fashion. Because if we think about, for instance, the fashion district, the garment district in New York, the advantage of it is that you have tall buildings, and on each level there's the material supplier, there's the designer, there's the seamstress, and you can easily access each of those components of the garment. Now, it's much harder in a building, but it's also, even if you're working on a much smaller scale, maybe industrial design scale project, the ability to actually like seamlessly get a material, even if it's not physically sent to you, but rather downloaded, have it and apply it to your project much more quickly, sort of reminds me of that economy of proximity that you get in certain places where fashion's sort of emerged. I'm curious, especially as somebody who has come from fashion, what lessons you've learned from that world and how do you apply it to the larger scale worlds of interior design, architecture, and construction?
It's very interesting because I think I just had this conversation with someone who's like specialized in BIM, and everyone keep thinking about other industry figured it out. And I love this. I love this topic just because I think I struggle daily of like jumping industries, like because I don't have the deep knowledge in architecture. I don't know how like you guys actually use concrete, for example. Definitely not as much as like how I know. There's one time I went knitting like on an industrial level for like went to like a circular knitting machine manufacturer for like a whole month just to understand how yarn actually fabricate into textiles. But I don't have that deep knowledge. But when I got to the AEC industry or A&D, everyone was like, oh, fashion so figured this out because everyone is talking about like 3D product creation. You're getting this like every step of the way. So what was the lesson? I was like, what are you guys talking about? So
Was that a surprise?
fragmented.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, it's so fragmented. Everyone's doing their own thing. Nobody can see the entire value chain in a clear view. This is why people are like always like you're building a layer on top of the workflow. Same thing with all these people trying to change AEC industry. Like there's, all this like either it's project management software or it's like the automation to help you to do like takeoff, like all kinds of things. You're building a layer on top of the existing workflow. So I guess my biggest learning is I think every single industry who touch physical goods have similar challenges in terms of over time, it's been so long, everyone developed vertical expertise. They don't really know how to integrate with each other. It's incredibly hard. They don't know each other's language. There's always people on the surface level try to connect all the dots without deeply understanding each vertical. The benefits of that is you can quickly connect or build a very simplified workflow that makes sense on the surface level. But I think the problem have to be solved at each vertical, like very deeply, like in the long run. So basically you can have this like workflow on the surface level, but like, so the vertical first and then the second vertical, it's a long process. But I do want to say this, the difference between fashion and architecture is like the turnaround time. So for example, fashion industry want to solve the whole like 3D, want to use the whole virtual creation process to solve two things. First is time to sample, because we created this tariff is such a popular topic right now, but we created this monster industry that's so rely on offshoring manufacturing. Not saying it's good or bad, but people wait so long to get a sample from overseas. So that's like the first thing we try to solve. And the second one is just to solve the amount of iterations in the design process. Same thing with A&D. Like you want to use visualization to like confirm with your clients to solve the iteration. Like you can't actually physically build a room or build a building like just, in a amount of like days or month. So that's almost a necessity. Like in fashion, it wasn't a necessity. So they were purely driven by, let's just make this more efficient. And they could do that because I guess the software is more or less like much more modular, and the type of product they're building is like relatively simpler than a building or than an entire house that you have to build all this like different components in it.
I think that the idea about the different verticals is extremely insightful. I would also argue that within architecture, you have different verticals in different places. People work differently based on geography, based on construction, culture, and that adds another layer of things that maybe have to be smoothed out before you can then truly create some more sort of uniform system.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting topic. I recently learned from an outsider perspective as well. The amount of roles in the AEC industry just like surprised me. And constantly I was like, okay, so you're an engineering consultant, but in what? And then it turns out there's 20 different engineering consultant components in this entire chain, and everyone's like, so from like, again, from an outsider perspective, like when I was like looking at, okay, is everyone just like working in BIM and just collaborate and have like everything just being handed off perfectly from this point out, and everyone can get information from this perfect BIM file and it will just go into construction. And
I wish.
Every
we all
time,
wish.
exactly. But again, that's like the outsider view of simplified workflow, right? In my mind, that's how it works. In reality, people have their own ways. So I feel the biggest challenge of digital digital challenge, any digital challenge, our human behavior, and we're always like dealing with that or fighting with that inertia.
So I think on this topic, it's good to ask you a forward-looking question. Since you have so much experience in digital material ecosystems, both in fashion and now in AEC, if you could change anything about how we work in this ecosystem right now, what would that be?
I would say the earlier the digitization happen in the supply chain, the better. So it's the best if they can happen in the origin, which is where the suppliers or manufacturing happening. But again, we talk so much about like knowledge gaps or human behaviors, like that's not their expertise. They don't, even if they want to do this perfectly, they would not know how. So they definitely need a lot of help or a lot of education. And
So when you're saying like in the beginning, you mean at the conception of the material, like before it goes into manufacturing, the digital and physical thing kind of is birthed at the same time.
I hope they can, yeah, I hope they can be born at the same time. At least at the moment they confirm this is something can be produced, because we talk about this whole thing. It's a digital, not all digital representation can be produced in the physical world. But the moment the manufacturer is the one who hold all this like knowledge. But the moment they decide, okay, this is something I'm going to produce, supply to different buildings, to different environment, then I think that's the best place for digitization to happen. So yeah, that's kind of like the number one thing I think I would want to change.
So I'm just trying to think like what big change would that bring to our industry? Would everyone who's working digitally just start using things that they know can be physically produced? Because I know I'm speculating, Alex, you tell me, as an architect, do you always try to use materials that already exist? Or do you try to envision something first and then try to fit something in? And if you can't, see if the manufacturer is willing to make something different for you.
Look, you know this idea of the burden of knowledge, which is as we progress in history, there's more stuff that has already been discovered. It's harder to uncover new things. It's sort of similar with materials. There's a certain palette that already exists. You have woods, you have metals, glasses, things like that. Of course, there are people innovating materials and making things out of mushrooms or foam. Those things are cool, but they're not widely and marketly accessible. So at least in my process, I think it's more of a combination of things. If you think about the idea of lateral thinking with weathered technology, it's trying to find recombinations of things that haven't been deployed before but can be done in an interesting way. And I'm sure fashion does that quite a lot because you're working at a much smaller scale. I think with architecture, you're also dealing with style and aesthetic. Like if the client wants something to be mid-century modern or they want it to be Northern European looking, you're going to be using a lot of wood. It's just going to be what it is, right? And there's a cultural pressure there. Or if you want to have a nice, shiny, modern skyscraper, it's going to be glass and steel. So I think there are a lot of decisions that are already made for you, in fact. But I do think that digitalization opens up the possibility for what you can draw in. So in my own process, I think what really changed the game was when when V-Ray introduced their own material library, and they were just all right there. And they're all existing materials that I'm familiar with, but I didn't have to like go in and find the glass that I had sort of made back in the day that sort of didn't work. I had a bunch of different options. Some had fritz, some had stripes, things like that. So when you have access to that whole like palette, it's like in those kitchen shows where they have all the ingredients in front of them. Then you can come up with something interesting.
So another layer that I can add as a perspective from a real estate developer is that what's important to me is knowing where can I buy these material and how much they are. So I'm curious, for the digitalized material environment, is there a future plan to connect these informations, the market information and the digital asset informations?
I think this is like super interesting. Like what you guys are both saying is like so architect perspective. Like I love this so much. It's like kind of like, hey, I'm this like creator of human and you guys are all human. Like, so it's like a very general level. Like when I look at it, like if I'm God, sorry, this is so bad. Sorry, if I'm God,
Okay.
I'll look at every one of you and you're like, hey, you're all human, great. And you're all like human in the turf of United States, great. And then when we look down to like from a material level, when we look at like I think Alex mentioned like you use a lot of woods. From manufacturer perspective or from a materiality perspective, every single woods is so different. You can break down woods into, like oak, like cherry, like all different kind of woods, and you will break down to like manufacturer level is like who produced this with what finish, with what performance and all that. So I think when you look at those things from like very different level of hierarchy, manufacturers, material suppliers care about things from bottom up. It's like, I created this is my materials, and this is how they look like. You guys just kind of care more about the style and aesthetic. So they will eventually meet in the middle. You will find something that fit your budget, fit your style, fit your aesthetic. And in my world, when I'm trying to, like a lot of my past work and current work is focused on digitizing the exact materials, which means all the identification Minku you were mentioning, it's like super duper important. It's almost the number one thing. We can be digitizing the two visually identical material from two different manufacturers, but they're different because they're being produced by different people.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also an interesting connection too. So like if we talk about wood, I might spec wood as the architect, and then Minku might say, look, we don't have the budget for that. So we're going to have to do something else. We're going to have to use veneer, or we're going to have to use synthetic wood. We're going to have to use an engineered composite. So I think there's also this interesting moment where probably the idea of what something looks like can be maintained, but maybe the actual fidelity of the actual material is different based on availability, cost, even transportation, for instance. And then there's also areas where you want to be ultra specific. Like if you're designing the new wing of the MoMA, you're going to want that specific marble, and you're going to go to Italy and you're going to make sure that they bookend so they look nice, because those imperfections that can't necessarily be generated digitally, that the digitizer can't necessarily predict, are what's going to make the space special as well. So I think there's also ranges, and it depends on the type of project that you're working on.
Yeah, and like you literally just touched one point of the combination of like different things, and you're recreating a type of materials based on existing visual, existing performance, and you kind of like, oh, we cannot afford this wood in the budget, then let's just use veneer. It's technically a new material, like not net new material for the planet, but it's technically a new material just showed up in your project, right? So people do that creation all the time. Same thing, I think you mentioned mushroom material before. Like they try to use mushroom to produce like protein-based material, I think are initially for leather. It's not a net new chemical, but the process is so dramatically different. So it's very novel. There's a lot of things like happen that way. Like we innovate in the process level, and we try to achieve different purposes. Maybe sustainability, maybe aesthetic, but yeah, there's a lot of ways to redefine like new materials.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. I think since you were able to mention God, it's a great time to think from God's perspective. In the future, looking back, how would you characterize the era that we're currently in?
Oh my God. Actually, I think about that a lot. I think about looking back to the history all the time in the perspective of how do where we are as human, like in like 200 years from now on. So I think a lot of things we did in the past, like at the moment, we thought it was so clever or enlightening, and it turns out to be stupid. There's a lot of numerous examples we can use, right? Especially in the medical history, for example. Design, however, I think is very interesting. Like I'm still like very fascinated about a lot of different design philosophies we kind of defined in the past. I think it's still like we can almost still treat it as a new thing every decade, just because we interpret it differently. We have different tools, we had different mindset. And growing up in this like a digital era, I think we're all like similar age, but we kind of were in between this like not super digital and super digital chasm. Like we go through this entire chasm. But just to answer your question, I think the evolution of information, I don't even want to say technology, but like the AI is basically backed by an incredible amount of computational power and ability to absorb all the knowledge in a very effective way. So the evolution of how information is being absorbed, displayed, and transferred to us is just new. it's very new to everybody. I'm not going to say it's magical because it's not. We know how it happened. Humans have been trying this for like many years. I saw this like really amazing chart. I can't remember who drew it. It's like the AI revolutions, like basically between the AI was like a monkey level to like superhuman level. It's like this like little tiny gap. Like before we realize it's like, oh, holy shit, like so ChatGPT can answer all this question in like a matter of seconds. I have to do all this research for like a week or two. I think we're in an era of super confused. We don't know what to do. We don't know if we should adjust our workflow. We don't know if this is temporary, like eventually it's going to collapse. We realize like AI is not going to do as good as a job as we thought they could do. I think there's a lot of really, really good expectation. For example, I've been vibe coding in the past, I don't know how many months, like which I could never do in the like let's say a year ago. Like now I can just like, hey, just create this website for me in like a couple of minutes and it looks perfectly good. I skip like time in design engineering and it's all surface level. It doesn't mean it's going to be functional, but it speed up my thinking process. So maybe that's as good as it gets. Or maybe at the end of the day, like it will start to design new skyscrapers and piping and all the engineering structures inside of the building at the same time if they got enough knowledge and the knowledge is being well labeled. So I will characterize this piece of time as confused, exciting, and yeah. And I think that's where we are.
Yeah, I'm definitely confused, but I'm also excited. Every time you open up AI, it's like, what? How did this happen? How are we here? You know?
But which AI though? What AI are you talking about?
Well, I think it's I'm starting to use a lot more to look at visualization actually. Like I put in just snipping of what I'm normally doing in my workflow, put it into ChatGPT and have it give me a perspective on it. It's pretty incredible what it can do. And I think that a lot of times when it comes to design, you need fast iteration. And so there's this moment in between just pure generative design and then also pure analog design where you can use AI to potentially help you iterate much more quickly.
But I think it's not necessarily that part is much more feedback in design, right?
Yeah.
Like when you're designing by yourself, you know you're biased, but even if someone has some injection of an outside idea in response to what you put in front of them, that kind of gets the wheels spinning. And I think, probably what we're experiencing is that we no longer have to have another person do that. It's something that's much more accessible.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to materials, the point of materials is you're trying to elicit some sort of emotion, to be honest. You're trying to create an atmosphere. And usually you're responding, if you're designing a building or a space, to the client's requirements. What AI can now do is sort of give you like a test run, like, hey, look at this. Does it look better in wood, or does it look better in leather? Does it look better in steel and concrete? It can generate those things too, but it can also give you the perspective, which I think is really powerful.
That's actually a really good point, if you don't mind. One of the architects I talked with, they were like, well, these days clients just come with like Mid-Journey render and to show us just like, hey, this is what I want. Like I got this from Mid-Journey and like, this is kind of the direction I want to go. So it's kind of like it's a very refreshing way of thinking about the workflow. So if we can get to a good point, I know there's a lot of like limitation about like structure or like they don't really understand space at this point. But once it gets to a really good point, do you feel like, because digitizing all this like physical elements and the physical ingredients are kind of like the middle process, try to like feed into the tools. Do you feel we can get to a good point that we never need to digitize anything in the middle? Like AI will just start from the beginning, jumping all the way to the end and just cross all the middle process for you.
Well, it may not be a popular opinion, and I know many architects might cringe, but I think it's a good thing that the developers are coming with their Mid-Journey images, because then it allows you to talk more about the visuals on a deeper level. Like it's not about shiny images, now everyone can make it. So what is that design about? What's the idea behind it? I think becomes more valuable and worth talking about. So I see it as a good thing.
Yeah, I think democratization of design is a good thing. Like Minku, we agree, but I know there's a lot of people out there who are a little bit worried about that possibility. But there are a lot of challenges that need to be solved, and I don't think that just one group of people has the capacity or the wherewithal to actually solve those problems. So if we can be more synthetic and use, I think, AI more as a communicative tool rather than just simply a replacement tool for labor, then we have a lot of potential in front of us.
Yeah, visual communication becomes no longer one directional. It becomes a real communication now.
Yeah, and
So
you know, like you could have meetings where you're generating those ideas really quickly, rather than in the past, it was like, I kind of want it to look like this. Okay, go back, maybe work all night, and then come back to me the next day. Now it's just do it right there.
Do you feel like this? This is like rather personal, but I sometimes feel like because it's so fast, I kind of lose the chance to think like 2 level deeper. Sometimes it's like it gave me feedback so fast, or like, oh, this is like good enough, without going through this like painful process of like creating something in my mind. Not saying it will be, I may not create something better, but I think that deep process allowed me to like think everything a little deeper and come up with different perspective. I feel with the quick feedback, I'm like losing that a little bit.
Well, I'm sure the blockage will come along the way. So in architecture, for example, because of the lack of preciseness, you have the look and feel of it. But once you start actually drawing it in dimension, you'll realize, oh, this may not work or this may work. So I see it just as, I don't think there's any fear personally in utilizing AI and to actually prompt and actually have you break through those initial thresholds more easily.
I also think that there's always a creative tempo. There's moments where you push things forward, you discover something, and then you have to take a step back. I've always pushed myself to actually create something and then go to sleep and then come back with fresh eyes, because when you like remove yourself from all the technical processes of creating renderings, which is what I spend a lot of time doing, you start to see things from their value rather than all the labor that you've put into something, and you can be a little bit less biased. So I think that still exists. I think it's up to us to discover the process that allows us to get that tempo right.
Yeah, and it's increasing separation between design as a design process and design as a production process. You can spend a lot less time in production and a lot more intention in design. So it's not like I need to rush here in order to produce it there. I can spend my time, maybe do more hand sketching, more things that are a little bit rough, more just artifacts of the mind, because I know that I could just go to Midjourney and prompt it out if I am clear with my idea.
Yeah, I think it's very helpful just in general, like to have someone that's not a person to have this like iterative process and just like test things really quickly with your mind.
That's it for today's episode of Most Modern. If this conversation with Manwen sparks something for you, don't just keep it to yourself. Hit like, subscribe, and drop us a review. That one click helps us grow the movement, reach new listeners, and bring sharper conversations about the future of the built world to the forefront. Thanks for listening, and we'll hope to see you next time.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트